Have you ever come home after a long day only to find that your driveway is blocked by your neighbor's car? It's more than just an inconvenience. It's a real problem. But what if I told you that one person decided to take matters into their own hands in a way that no one saw coming? And yes, it's completely legal. At first, the person tried to take the more peaceful route, simply talking to their neighbor. They knew that approaching the situation calmly could resolve things without escalating to something extreme. So they knocked on their neighbor's door, hoping for a simple conversation. They explained how often their driveway was blocked and how it was making it difficult for them to come and go, especially during busy hours. The goal was clear: work things out before any tension started to build up. At first, it seemed like a reasonable request. After all, most people would understand the frustration of not being able to park in your own driveway. The neighbor, however, didn't quite see things the same way. They made excuses, claiming they didn't have any other place to park, or that it was only for a few minutes. The more they talked, the more it became clear that the neighbor didn't fully grasp the inconvenience they were causing. When polite conversation didn't get the results they were hoping for, the person considered another option: mediation. Mediation services can sometimes offer a neutral third party to help people find common ground. This could be especially helpful in situations like this, where emotions were starting to run high, but there was still a chance for a peaceful resolution. The idea was to bring in a professional who could facilitate a conversation between them and hopefully reach an agreement that worked for both sides. Mediation often helps people see things from a different perspective, and it can be a less costly and stressful alternative to more formal legal actions. But even with mediation in mind, it wasn't guaranteed that the neighbor would be open to the idea. So while it was a potential solution, the outcome was still uncertain. As the attempts at polite conversation and mediation failed to make any headway, frustration started to build. The driveway remained blocked regularly, and the inconvenience was starting to take a real toll. At this point, the person felt like they had no other option but to take drastic measures. It wasn't just about a single instance of blocked access. It was becoming a recurring issue that was affecting their daily life. After all, what's the point of having a driveway if you can't use it when you need to? The idea of digging a trench around the driveway came up as a bold way to create a physical barrier, something that would prevent the neighbor from blocking the driveway in the future. But it wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision. They carefully considered the practicality of such a move. The trench would need to be deep enough to make parking impossible without physically overcoming a significant obstacle, yet not so deep that it would be a major eyesore or danger to anyone passing by. One of the most pressing questions was whether this would violate any property laws. They knew that property boundaries could be a tricky thing to navigate, so they spent time researching exactly where their property line ended and their neighbors began. The trench could only go so far without infringing on the neighbor's land, and it was important to be sure it would stay within the legal confines. After all, modifying a driveway or altering shared spaces could lead to costly lawsuits or fines if done improperly. They also considered the impact the trench might have on access rights. In some cases, there could be easements involved, meaning that a neighbor might have the right to use the space in some way, even if it was technically on someone else's property. They had to be certain that they weren't unintentionally violating any rights that allowed their neighbor to park there. Otherwise, this plan could backfire in ways they hadn't even considered. Despite all the potential complications, the more they thought about it, the more it felt like the only way to regain control over their space. The trench wouldn't just solve the problem of being blocked in, it would send a clear message that this couldn't continue any longer. It was a big decision, and not one taken lightly, but the sense of powerlessness was starting to fade as they pictured the trench taking shape. Before making any major changes to their property, they had to pause and really understand the legal side of things. Easements were something that kept coming up in their research, and it became clear that they needed to fully grasp what that meant for their situation. An easement is essentially a legal right that allows someone to use part of another person's property for a specific purpose, like accessing a shared driveway or crossing someone's land to get to a road. In this case, if there was an easement in place that allowed their neighbor to park or drive across their driveway, digging a trench could become a legal nightmare. Understanding where the property boundaries were and whether any easements were in play became crucial. If the neighbor had an easement that gave them access to the driveway, blocking that access could not only lead to conflict but also legal action. It was important to know if there were any formal agreements or rights that allowed the neighbor to use the space, even if they weren't currently in place. These legal agreements could be part of the property deed or even informally understood between neighbors, and they could be tough to navigate without professional help. Beyond easements, there were also the broader implications of altering shared spaces. Even if the driveway itself was technically on their land, they needed to consider how digging a trench might affect not just the neighbor's access, but the neighborhood as a whole. If the trench interfered with a shared water flow or drainage system, they could face additional legal challenges. Even small changes could have unintended consequences, and they had to be sure they weren't violating local zoning laws or building codes. For example, digging a trench too close to the property line might not only be disruptive, but also legally problematic if it encroached on what could be considered the neighbor's rights or even violated safety regulations. Navigating the rules around property rights meant weighing the desire for a solution against the risk of running into serious legal trouble. While the trench might solve the parking problem, it also raised questions about whether they were truly within their rights to make these kinds of changes to the land. This was a situation that required careful attention to detail and an understanding of how property law worked in their area. Without that, a simple solution could turn into a long and costly legal battle. Once the decision was made to go ahead with the trench, the next step was designing a way to make the driveway both secure and accessible. The idea of a drawbridge came into play as a creative solution, something that would keep the neighbor from blocking the driveway while still allowing the homeowner to drive in and out when needed. The drawbridge wouldn't be a traditional wooden bridge like something out of a medieval castle. Instead, it would be a simple mechanical system that could be raised and lowered easily, just like a gate, but with the added twist of offering a full barrier when needed. The design itself was both practical and functional. The trench would be deep enough to stop any car from simply parking across the driveway, but the drawbridge would give the homeowner the flexibility to control access to the driveway. The plan was to install a small motorized system that could lift the drawbridge up when they needed to park or exit, then lower it back into place to block the driveway when not in use. The materials chosen were sturdy but not too heavy, ensuring that the drawbridge would be reliable without being overwhelming or difficult to maintain. However, while the technical side of things was progressing smoothly, the social and relational implications started to weigh heavily. The neighbor was already upset by the disruption, and it was hard to ignore the fact that this action might escalate the tension. A drawbridge was a bold move, an unmistakable sign that the homeowner was taking control of the situation, but it could easily be perceived as petty or confrontational. What would the other neighbors think? Would they view this as a reasonable way to handle the situation, or would it make the neighborhood feel divided? As the project began to take shape, the homeowner realized that the drawbridge was more than just a practical solution. It was also a symbol. It was a way of saying, "This is my space and I will defend it." But at the same time, it wasn't lost on them that this could put them at odds with the entire community. A strange raised bridge in front of their driveway would certainly catch people's attention, and not everyone would appreciate the drastic nature of the solution. Some neighbors might see it as an overreaction or an unnecessary disruption, while others might even view it as a sign of a neighborhood feud. Ultimately, the balance between securing the driveway and managing relationships was delicate. The design of the drawbridge might solve the practical issue of blocking the driveway, but the social ramifications were harder to predict. It wasn't just about creating a physical barrier. It was about managing how that barrier would be perceived by everyone around them. Before making any further moves, they knew they couldn't simply rely on their own understanding of the situation. It was crucial to ensure that everything they were planning was completely within the bounds of the law. The last thing they wanted was to go through the effort of building a trench and drawbridge, only to end up in legal trouble for violating local property laws or zoning regulations. The first step was to research the local laws. Property modifications, especially those that could affect shared spaces or alter the appearance of a home, often came with strict guidelines. They started by looking into zoning ordinances in their area to understand whether digging a trench could potentially violate any codes related to construction, land use, or safety. There were also questions around drainage. If the trench interfered with water flow or drainage systems, it could lead to unexpected legal consequences down the road. Then they turned to legal experts. They knew it wasn't enough to just read a few online articles or ask a neighbor for advice. They needed to be absolutely sure that their actions were legally sound. Consulting a property lawyer was the logical next step. The lawyer could provide expert insights into whether the trench and the drawbridge were feasible under property laws and whether they were overstepping any legal boundaries. More importantly, the lawyer could help clarify the issue of property rights. For example, if the neighbor had an easement that granted them access to the driveway, any modification to that space could trigger a legal dispute. The lawyer also advised on the importance of documenting everything, from the initial conversation with the neighbor to the plans for the trench and drawbridge. If anything were to go wrong, having a paper trail would help protect them legally. They also had to be aware of the possibility of the neighbor taking legal action if they felt their rights had been infringed upon, so the lawyer offered suggestions on how to handle any potential lawsuits or how to avoid escalating the situation too quickly. After a few consultations and some in-depth research, they received the green light. The trench and drawbridge, as long as they followed specific guidelines, were well within their rights. It turned out that local laws were more flexible than they had initially thought, and they could indeed make alterations to their property as long as they didn't encroach on the neighbor's rights or disrupt the neighborhood in any significant way. With legal validation in hand, they could now proceed with confidence, knowing that the groundwork was laid for a solution that was not only practical, but legally sound. As the trench and drawbridge project neared completion, one big question loomed. How would the neighbor react to such a bold move? The homeowner had already made attempts at peaceful communication, but with the drawbridge now standing in place, there was no denying the escalating tension. The neighbor might feel that their parking habits had been publicly challenged, and the drastic nature of the solution could easily be seen as an act of defiance. It was easy to imagine the neighbor's first reaction. They might be furious, seeing the trench as a personal attack or an overreaction to a minor issue. The idea of a drawbridge, something so unexpected and unconventional, could be perceived as a deliberate move to embarrass them or make their life more difficult. If the neighbor had been unwilling to work things out before, this public alteration to the driveway might feel like a slap in the face, making it even harder to approach the situation calmly. But beyond the neighbor, the entire community could also have strong opinions. Some might see it as a clever and unique solution, while others could view it as a petty, childish act that disrupts the peace of the neighborhood. The sight of a drawbridge in a suburban driveway would undoubtedly attract attention, and some neighbors might even begin to question whether such an extreme measure was necessary. Gossip could spread quickly, with people choosing sides, further dividing the community. Managing these potential conflicts required careful thought. The homeowner could start by reaching out to the neighbor, acknowledging the discomfort the situation might cause, and offering a chance for a face-to-face discussion. The key here would be to keep the conversation focused on the practical reasons for the modification, emphasizing that it wasn't about retaliation, but about protecting their own space and ensuring that they could use their driveway freely. A calm, open dialogue might help diffuse some of the tension and remind the neighbor that this action, however drastic, was meant to solve a recurring problem. It would also be important to prepare for a range of reactions from the community. If the project gained attention, the homeowner might have to engage in some damage control. This could mean explaining their side of the story to concerned neighbors, clarifying that the situation was more about setting boundaries than seeking revenge. They could even invite neighbors over to see the drawbridge firsthand, emphasizing that it was a practical solution and not meant to cause chaos. By being transparent and taking the time to communicate, they might be able to prevent the situation from escalating into something more personal or public. Ultimately, navigating the neighbor's reaction and the community's response was going to require a delicate balance. The homeowner would need to be proactive in managing perceptions, aiming to maintain good relations with everyone involved while also standing firm in their decision to protect their property. While digging a trench and constructing a drawbridge may have been the most dramatic solution, it wasn't the only legal option available to address the ongoing issue of a blocked driveway. There were other routes that could have been taken, ones that might have resolved the situation in a less confrontational and more formal way. One such option was filing a formal complaint. In many municipalities, local authorities have systems in place for handling property disputes between neighbors. If a neighbor's actions, like blocking a driveway, are interfering with someone's ability to use their property, they can often file a complaint with the city or county zoning or parking authority. This process typically involves documenting the problem, such as noting how often the driveway is blocked and the impact it has on daily life. Local government officials could then investigate the complaint, issue warnings, and in some cases, impose fines on the neighbor for violating parking ordinances or other local rules. If the neighbor's behavior persisted despite warnings, the homeowner could also consider seeking an injunction. An injunction is a legal order that could prevent the neighbor from continuing to block the driveway. This legal tool would typically require a court hearing, but if the homeowner could prove that the blockage was consistently preventing access to their property, a judge might rule in their favor and issue a formal injunction. An injunction could compel the neighbor to stop parking in the driveway area, providing a clear legal resolution without resorting to drastic measures like physical barriers. Another potential solution could be to explore mediation services through the courts. While mediation had been considered early on, it remained a valid option even after the trench idea was set in motion. Preventing driveway disputes starts long before any tension builds up. The most important step is clear and open communication. It's easy for small misunderstandings to snowball into bigger problems, so taking the time to discuss expectations with neighbors can save a lot of trouble down the road. Whether it's making sure everyone knows where the boundaries lie or simply discussing parking habits, a little effort in the beginning can go a long way in avoiding future conflicts. Regular, polite conversations can help maintain good relationships and keep any issues from escalating. Another key preventive measure is putting agreements in writing, especially when it comes to shared spaces. If you and your neighbor share a driveway or parking area, having a clear legal agreement outlining who can park where and when can prevent any confusion. This is particularly important if the situation is more complex, like when an easement exists, giving one party the right to use part of the property. Having a formal, written understanding about the use of shared spaces can help ensure that both sides are on the same page and reduce the chances of disputes later on. It's also crucial to understand your property rights. Many people don't realize that property laws can be quite complex, especially when it comes to shared or disputed spaces. For example, parking in a space that belongs to someone else or making modifications to your property without understanding the legal boundaries can lead to serious legal trouble. Taking the time to familiarize yourself with local property laws, zoning regulations, and easements is a good way to avoid accidental violations. In case you're unsure about any legal aspects, consulting with a legal professional can help clarify your rights and prevent issues before they arise. Lastly, if conflicts do start to emerge, addressing them early and calmly can prevent them from spiraling out of control. Taking a proactive approach to prevent driveway disputes might seem like extra work, but it's much easier to resolve issues before they escalate into something more serious. Whether it's through communication, legal agreements, or seeking professional advice, staying informed and involved is key to keeping your driveway and your relationship with your neighbors clear and trouble-free. In the end, the decision to dig a trench and build a drawbridge was certainly an unconventional one, but it highlights the lengths some people are willing to go when they feel their personal space and property rights are being ignored. From the initial frustrations of a blocked driveway to the complex legal research and consultations that followed, every step was driven by the desire to regain control of what was rightfully theirs. Along the way, it became clear that, while dramatic, the trench and drawbridge were a physical manifestation of a larger issue, a clash of property rights, neighborly responsibilities, and personal boundaries. This story serves as a reminder that any solution, no matter how creative or extreme, should be carefully weighed against both legal and relational factors. While the trench and drawbridge were technically legal, the process involved careful consideration of local laws, property rights, and potential consequences for neighborly relations. Understanding the bigger picture, how actions might be perceived, and the legal implications they could have, was crucial to moving forward without escalating the situation further. Now we want to hear from you. Have you ever faced a similar dispute with a neighbor? What solutions did you try, or do you think you'd take a different route after seeing the story? Feel free to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments. Neighbor disputes can be tricky, but with the right mix of communication, legal knowledge, and patience, most of them can be resolved without resorting to anything so dramatic.